Whispers of the Void. Chapter 1, The Arrival. Alara stepped off the old, rickety train at Vrzan station, feeling the damp chill of the evening air press against her skin. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving only the faintest traces of daylight lingering in the sky. Her brother, Ian, had vanished in this place. She'd received a letter from a stranger who claimed to know something about him, offering cryptic words about the truth being hidden in Vrzan. Desperation had led her here, to this small, isolated village in the woods. It was nothing like the bustling city she had left behind. The village was eerily silent, as though it were frozen in time. The streets, lined with crooked houses and overgrown foliage, gave off the impression that the residents had long since stopped caring about anything but survival. The only sounds were the distant calls of crows, echoing through the trees. A few villagers stood in the windows of their homes, watching her with vacant eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were sizing her up, measuring her, as though she didn't belong here. As she walked through the village, her footsteps echoed on the cobblestone, and the oppressive silence grew thicker. The air itself seemed to hum with something unnatural, like a low, persistent vibration that made her skin crawl. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. No Wi-Fi. Nothing but an unsettling quiet. At the end of the street, an old, wooden inn stood like a relic of another age. The sign was worn, its letters almost unreadable, but it was the only place that seemed remotely welcoming. She hesitated before entering, but the weight of exhaustion and fear pressed her forward. She needed to stay somewhere, and this would have to do. The innkeeper, an elderly man with a face carved by years of worry, didn't seem surprised to see her. "You're the one looking for answers, aren't you?" His voice was raspy, and his eyes flickered with something dangerous when they met hers. "I'm looking for my brother," Alara replied, trying to steady her voice. "Ian McAllister. He disappeared about 6 months ago. I've been told he's here." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply motioned for her to follow him inside. The interior of the inn was dimly lit, with smoke curling lazily from an old fireplace. There were no other guests, and the air smelled of mildew and old wood. The atmosphere felt stifling, as if the place hadn't seen daylight in years. "We don't talk about your brother here," the innkeeper finally spoke, his tone low, almost conspiratorial. "People who come looking for him usually don't leave." Alara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The man didn't respond immediately, instead locking the door behind her. "It's not just your brother you need to worry about. It's what he found." Alara froze. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer her. He simply led her to a room at the end of a narrow, creaky hallway, where the faintest sound of whispering seemed to seep from the walls. As he handed her the key, he gave her a final warning. "Stay inside tonight. Don't go outside after dark. And whatever you do, don't look at the woods." She was left standing in the doorway, the chill of the evening creeping in through the cracks, and a sense of dread creeping up her spine. Chapter 2, The Village of Silence. The next morning, Alara awoke to a sense of unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. The inn was unnervingly quiet, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards as she moved. She made her way downstairs, but the innkeeper was nowhere to be found. It was strange, how something so ordinary could seem so unsettling. The village looked even more desolate in the daylight. The streets were empty, the windows of the houses staring blankly into the streets like dark, hollow eyes. The residents didn't greet her, nor did they even seem to acknowledge her presence. She felt like an intruder in a place that was beyond welcoming. Her first stop was the local market. The few stalls set up in the square were unattended, their contents, wilted vegetables, dried meats, and faded fabrics, arranged in an almost ritualistic way, as if the market itself was more of a relic than a place for trade. The air smelled faintly of decay. Alara approached an older woman sitting at one of the stalls, a bundle of withered flowers in her hands. "Excuse me," Alara began hesitantly. "I'm looking for someone. A man named Ian McAllister. Have you seen him?" The woman didn't look up, her hands trembling as she adjusted the flowers. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one comes here to stay. They come to leave." Alara felt a chill run down her spine, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was terribly wrong with this place. She tried to ask again, but the woman simply turned her back, leaving her standing there, her question unanswered. As Alara wandered deeper into the village, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was avoiding her, purposefully steering clear of eye contact. It wasn't just that the villagers were cold, it was as if they were scared, or perhaps resigned, to her presence. She passed a group of children playing near a dilapidated building, but when they saw her, They quickly scattered, their faces contorted in fear. She reached the village square, where a large stone well stood at the center. The air around it was heavy, oppressive, as if something ancient lingered there. As she approached, the whispers began. They started faintly, just beyond her hearing, like a soft murmur in the distance. But as she leaned closer to the well, they became clearer, more insistent. "Leave now, Alara. It is too late. The void calls." She spun around, but the square was still empty. No one had spoken to her. The whispers were coming from nowhere. Or perhaps from everywhere. Suddenly, the ground beneath her seemed to shift, the well's stone walls narrowing as though they were closing in on her. She stumbled back, gasping for air, her heart racing. The village, this cursed, silent place, was alive with something she couldn't comprehend. And the deeper she went into it, the more she felt herself slipping, losing control of her own thoughts. With her pulse hammering in her chest, Alara turned on her heel and ran back toward the inn, desperate to escape the whispers that threatened to drown her mind. Chapter 3, The Library of Forgotten Souls. The oppressive air from the village hung over Alara like a heavy cloak, but she pushed on. She couldn't allow herself to leave without finding answers. She found the village library tucked away in a corner of the square, its weathered exterior almost swallowed by the surrounding ivy. The door creaked ominously as she entered, and the musty scent of old paper and dust filled the air. A few shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten tomes, some with bindings so ancient they were barely legible. The librarian, an old man with deep-set eyes and a hunched back, looked up at her without surprise. There was something oddly familiar about his gaze, but Alara couldn't place it. He didn't speak but motioned toward a large table where a collection of journals and manuscripts lay open, as if waiting for her. Alara approached cautiously, her fingers trembling as she picked up one of the journals. It was worn and old, its pages yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was frenzied, almost erratic. She began to read. "The veil is thin here. Too thin. And when it tears, we will all be lost. The void is coming, and we are its servants. We must open the door, or it will consume us." Her breath caught in her throat. The name on the journal's cover was Lucien, a name she had seen before in her brother's letters. He had found this place, just like she had. As she read further, a deep sense of dread filled her chest. Lucien had uncovered the same dark truths she had, and the whispers that had plagued him were now calling to her. Suddenly, the faint whispering returned, low and insistent. She turned around, but the librarian was gone, and the shelves were now lined with books that hadn't been there a moment ago. Each book seemed to radiate with an oppressive, dark energy. She closed the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls of the library seemed to close in around her, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The void was watching her, waiting for her to step closer to the abyss. But Alara had to know more. Chapter 4, The Glaring Eye. The following days passed in a blur, each moment marked by a growing sense of unease and an overwhelming feeling that something was wrong with the village. The villagers continued to avoid her, and the whispers became an ever-present part of her life. But it wasn't just the whispers anymore. Now, she was seeing things, shadowy figures darting at the edge of her vision, strange symbols etched into the walls of the inn when she wasn't looking, and mirrors that seemed to reflect something else entirely. One evening, just as the sun began to set, Alara was approached by a strange woman who had appeared in the village the day before. She was dressed in rags, with wild, unkempt hair, and her eyes gleamed with a dangerous knowledge. "You're looking for him," the woman rasped, her voice like gravel. "Your brother's soul is trapped in the void, but you won't save him. Not unless you pay the price." Alara's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned in close, her breath hot and stale against Alara's skin. "The void waits for those like you. You will find him, but you won't leave." The woman's eyes glowed briefly with an unnatural light before she disappeared into the shadows. Alara stood frozen, the words repeating in her head. "You will find him, but you won't leave." Chapter 5, The Echoing Shadows. Alara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. No matter where she went in the village, there was always someone staring from behind windows, from shadows in doorways. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the unease that gnawed at her grew worse with each passing hour. It was the whispers, more than anything, that unsettled her the most. They had begun to echo in her mind, even when she was alone. That evening, while walking through the forest's edge near the inn, Alara heard them again, low, unintelligible voices carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but they tugged at her, as if they were calling her name. She stopped in her tracks, listening carefully. The voices became clearer, sharper. "Alara, She turned quickly, but no one was there. Shaking her head, Alara stepped forward, her heart pounding, her footsteps swift against the damp earth. The trees around her loomed like dark, silent sentinels. Their twisted branches seemed to reach toward her as though they were alive. The forest seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. The deeper she ventured, the more the whispers grew in volume, now unmistakably distinct, her name repeated over and over. Alara. Alara. Come closer. She felt a cold, invisible hand brushing the back of her neck. Her breath hitched, and without thinking, she broke into a run, heart thumping as her shoes slipped on the wet ground. The shadows around her shifted, swirling like living things, following her every movement. A fleeting figure crossed her path, just a glimpse of a pale, gaunt face, its hollow eyes locked on hers. Alara, it whispered one final time before disappearing. When Alara finally made it back to the inn, she was breathless and drenched in sweat. She slammed the door behind her and sank against it, trembling. The feeling of the unseen presence still lingered in her mind, haunting her every thought. The whispering was no longer in the distance, it was inside her, vibrating through her bones. Chapter 6, The Mirror's Reflection. The next day, Alara decided to search for any further clues about her brother's disappearance. She had barely slept, the whispers and shadows still tormenting her every moment. She made her way to the inn's small parlor room, where an old mirror hung crookedly on the wall. It was an antique, its silver frame tarnished by age and neglect, but there was something about it that intrigued her. As she stared at her reflection, she noticed something strange. Her own face seemed to flicker, as if it wasn't quite right. She blinked, trying to shake the feeling, but when her eyes returned to the mirror, her reflection was different. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, just like the figure she'd seen in the woods. Alara! She gasped, backing away from the mirror. Her own reflection grinned at her with a twisted, unnatural smile. Join me, it whispered, its voice the same that had been calling her in the forest. Her body froze, and her reflection reached out as though trying to grab her. Heart racing, Alara stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. The mirror began to crack, its surface rippling as though it was alive. Each fracture seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly energy. The reflection began to melt, warping into something unrecognizable, its eyes still locked onto hers. She turned and fled, slamming the door shut behind her as she fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Her reflection was gone, but the terror it left behind lingered in her chest. The whispers had taken on a new, malevolent tone, each syllable wrapped in cold, insidious power. She couldn't escape them. Chapter 7, The Forbidden Ritual. Determined to understand what had happened to her brother, Alara ventured to the heart of the village, searching for any source of knowledge. There, she found a hidden alcove, an abandoned chapel at the edge of town. The chapel was overgrown with ivy and had a sense of abandonment that matched the rest of the village. Inside, dust and cobwebs blanketed the pews, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. She noticed an altar at the back, partially obscured by shadows. An eerie light flickered within, illuminating a series of strange, cryptic symbols carved into the stone floor. A small journal rested on the altar, its pages yellowed with age. As Alara opened the journal, she realized with a cold shiver that it was another account written by Lucienne. The entries detailed a ritual, one that involved opening a doorway to the void. "We found it," Lucienne wrote. "The door, hidden beneath the earth, connected us to something. Something old, ancient. But the price was steep. It took him first, then others. Soon, we'll all be its servants. I'm already losing myself, slipping into the darkness. And the voices. They speak of you, Alara." Alara's blood ran cold. The ritual had not only trapped Lucienne's soul, it had called out to her, drawing her into its grasp. The void was real, and it wanted her. She closed the journal with trembling hands, feeling as if she were being pulled deeper into its terrifying grip. The symbols on the floor seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, beckoning her to step forward. Chapter 8, The First Encounter. Later that evening, Alara felt a pull, a strange, magnetic force drawing her toward the forest once again. The air around her grew colder, the shadows thicker, and the whispers returned, louder this time, urgent and sharp. "Alara. You've come." The voice came from behind her, but when she turned, there was no one there. But something was different this time. The darkness had taken on a more tangible form. A figure stood in the clearing before her, a man with hollow eyes, his face obscured by shadow. He wore a tattered cloak, his body unnaturally tall, stretching into the night like a wraith. "Alara, I've been waiting for you," the figure said, his voice low and hypnotic. Her heart skipped a beat as the man stepped closer, his feet never touching the ground. There was something deeply wrong about him, something that didn't belong in this world. "I know what you seek," he continued, his smile twisted. "You want your brother back. But at what cost?" He stepped forward, and Alara felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a weight pressing against her chest. The figure's eyes glowed briefly with an otherworldly light, and in that moment, Alara understood. The man was not just a stranger, he was an agent of the void. He had come for her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's smile grew wider as he reached toward her, the darkness behind him writhing like a living thing. "You have a choice, Alara," he whispered, his fingers brushing against her face. "Join us, or watch your world crumble." Before she could respond, the figure vanished into the night, leaving her alone in the forest. But she knew she couldn't escape him, or the void, any longer. They would come for her again. Chapter 9, The Heart of Darkness. With each passing day, Alara felt herself losing grip on reality. The whispers had turned into voices, real voices, each one offering her something different. Power. Knowledge. Freedom. But they all promised the same thing: her soul would belong to the void. Determined to confront whatever force controlled the village, she returned to the chapel, the place where it all began. The symbols on the floor had grown brighter, more intense, as if the ritual were nearing completion. The air crackled with dark energy, and the whispers filled the space, swirling around her like a storm. "Alara!" A voice called out. It was her brother, Ian. She turned toward the altar, but instead of her brother, she saw only darkness, a swirling vortex that seemed to devour everything in its path. The void was opening before her, the door between worlds widening. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the edge of the portal. A wave of cold and despair washed over her, and a single word echoed in her mind: escape. But it was too late. The ground trembled beneath her, and the air around her twisted. The void had claimed its first victim. Chapter 10, The Voice of the Void. Alara fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the void's presence. The darkness was all-consuming, a force that ate away at her very soul. But within the depths of the dark, she heard a voice, a familiar voice. "Alara." She lifted her head, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice came from the center of the void, from the darkness itself. "Brother?" she whispered, trembling. "Yes, Alara. It's me," Ian's voice replied, though it was distant and hollow. "You have to stop this. You're being consumed." The darkness grew thicker around her, swallowing everything in its path. The portal was opening wider, its pulse stronger, as the whispers grew into a maddening roar. She reached out, calling for her brother, but the voice faded into nothingness. At that moment, Alara realized the truth: there was no way to save him. The void had already taken him. And soon, it would take her as well. Chapter 11, The Broken Memory. The whispers in Alara's mind grew louder, more insistent. They clawed at her, threatening to drown her in their relentless tide. Every memory, every thought felt distorted, twisted by the void's presence. Her brother's face, his smile, his laughter, faded, replaced by an empty, soulless shell. She stumbled through the streets of the village, unsure of where she was going or how much time had passed. The walls seemed to close in around her, the buildings warping, their edges bending and twisting as if they, too, were losing their grip on reality. "Alara! Alara!" She spun around, her eyes wide with fear. The shadows were following her now, dark, crawling shapes that slid across the ground like liquid nightmares. The voices had merged into a cacophony, a constant noise in her head, drowning out everything else. Her memories flashed before her eyes, her brother, her family, her life before all of this. But the memories were fading, becoming less and less real with each passing moment. She didn't know who she was anymore. Chapter 12, The Descent. The village was no longer a place. It had become a labyrinth, an endless maze of distorted streets and broken buildings. Every turn brought her deeper into the void, its presence pressing down on her like a physical weight. She could feel herself slipping away, her sense of self dissolving into the darkness. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and the more she tried to escape, the further she seemed to fall. "Alara." She heard her brother's voice again, but this time, it was different. His voice was cold, detached. "Join me," he whispered. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void. There was no escape. Chapter 13, The Price of Knowledge. Alara stood before the portal once more, the darkness swirling around her, beckoning her forward. She knew what would happen if she crossed the threshold. She would become a part of it, just like her brother. But the price of knowledge was too great to resist. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the cold, swirling vortex. And in that moment, the void reached back. Chapter 14, The Final Descent. The world around her twisted, contorted, and then shattered. The darkness consumed everything, the village, her memories, her very existence. There was nothing left, only the void. Alara. Her brother's voice echoed from the depths of the darkness. You are one of us now, the voice said, cold and unfeeling. And then, everything went silent. Chapter 15, A World Without Her. The village stood still. Empty. Silent. No sign of Alara remained, no trace of her ever having been there. The inn was empty, the chapel abandoned. And the voices? They had stopped whispering. But somewhere, deep in the forest, the void waited. And it always called, patiently, for the next soul.